Şimdi sevgili David McWilliams'ı buraya davet edelim bir sahneden giderken. İrlanda'dan geldi. İlk günden beri bizimle 4 gün 4 gecelik maratonumuzda. Kendisi ünlü bir yazar, ekonomist aslında. Bestseller'ı olması dışında keynote speaker, stand-up komedi bile yapmış, 3 sene kapalı gişe oynamış. Çok yönlü bir arkadaşımız ama özellikle bunların dışında da vizyonu, entelektüel öngörüleriyle bizim bu dijitalleşen dünyada Türkiye'nin ve dünyanın gidişine yönelik bizle görüşlerini paylaşması için davet ettik. Welcome David.
Yes.
Are you there?
Yeah.
Hello. How are you? How are you? Do I say günaydın, is it?
Günaydın.
Günaydın.
Yes.
Günaydın.
Welcome here, welcome to
No,
Turkey. We are so happy to have you here.
It's been an absolute pleasure to be here. It's a fantastic, amazing city. You're so lucky. I mean, it's enormous, and I think it's an amazing place. So I'm delighted.
So the stage is yours.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, let me.
Thank you.
Oh, actually, I'm lining against this thing.
You ask.
This is an unusual thing, but
It's too big. You want to share something?
I'll sit like this. Yeah, I'll sit like this. No, listen, it's a real pleasure, absolute pleasure to have been here. I'm slightly traumatized, though. I'm going to try and speak without an Irish accent. I'm going to try and speak like the Queen of England, which is very difficult for us. But and for the translator, wherever you are, I'll try and speak slowly so that you don't lose your marbles. Anyway, it's been I'm a little bit traumatized after my first day here in Istanbul because yesterday I decided to go for a Turkish shave in a barber. And typically you get shaved in a barber. And I went there and did all this sort of this stuff and all this stuff. It was great, it was fine, he was chatting away, we were talking about football and la la la. And then the strangest thing happened. Maybe Turkish men can tell me this. He applied hot wax up my nose. Right? This has never happened to me. I feel completely traumatized. I feel defiled by a Turkish barber. Right? Not only my nose, here and all around here. He was witnessing hairs in my forehead that I'm really. So I have no idea. So I went home and then he ripped it off completely. So if I sound a bit weird, it's because I'm still in a little bit of shock after my experience in the Turkish barber, which I will not be doing again. But, so just so you know, it's one of those Turkish exports you should stay quiet about. No, Gonca asked me to come and talk about the economy. I'm an economist by trade. And particularly talking about the economy in this year, 2022, is extraordinarily challenging simply because it is and has been a crazy, crazy year, an extraordinary year. But Vladimir Lenin, said something I think we should bear in mind. Lenin said that there are decades when nothing happens, and there are weeks when decades happen. And I think we're living through this type of weeks, this type of period, where our entire world is being changed, being turned upside down. And I think Lenin was absolutely right. We are living through these weeks. Now, what interests me is the fact that every generation, this is the funny thing, every generation believes that the trauma and the challenges they are going through are unique to them. So you'll see if you read the papers, this is unprecedented, this has never happened before, etc. But actually this is not true. Every generation, our parents and our grandparents, and prior to that, all experienced huge convulsions in their world, like we're experiencing now, and they got on with it. They actually survived the whole thing. So I think what we're going to talk about is a little bit of history to help us frame everything. Lenin wrote those words in 1922. So 100 years ago today, if you look at the world, what you will see is a broadly similar convulsive period. So 100 years ago today, this year, the Soviet Union is formed in 1922. For Turkish people, the Treaty of Lausanne began in November of 1922, which led to the Turkish state. For us Irish people, our state became independent also in 1922. If you think about a pandemic, in 1922, the global economy was just emerging from a 3-year pandemic, exactly like us. So consequently, it was called the Spanish flu, but by the way, it had nothing at all to do with Spanish people. The Spanish flu actually came from Arkansas in the United States. And Arkansas in the United States is a pig-rearing state. And the Spanish flu was a pig flu, a swine flu, that the workers, the young men who were working in the piggeries, contracted. They were then signed up to fight in the First World War. In 1917, they ended up, these contaminated Americans ended up in France. They then spread the virus to the Brits, to the French, and then to the Germans. But of course, these countries were not going to tell their people that their boys were being killed by swine flu, so they didn't say anything about it. They suppressed the news, and the poor old Spaniards reported it, and it became known as the Spanish flu. But the question for you is, like, think about the similarities. You have new states emerging. You also have the end of the Russian Civil War with a war in Ukraine. You have the Turkish state emerging. You have a whole sort of breakup of the old world in 1922. Ezra Pound, the famous American poet, said that 1922 was the year the modern world began. He also said it was the year the 20th century began, that everything that went before was a hangover from the old regime. And I suppose what we've got to do is figure out whether or not 2022, this year, is the year that the 21st century actually begins. That everything that went before was really a dress rehearsal. Again, when you look at, people talk about technology, and technology is changing the world, and it's so unique. And then if you actually look again, go back to 1922, and think about what they were doing. They had electricity for the first time. Far more influential technological breakthrough, arguably, than smartphones, than NFTs, than Bitcoin, than blockchain. You have electricity. You have the radio for the first time. Imagine what it was like to hear the radio in Anatolia. Imagine what it was like to have this little box in this little house, and suddenly you hear voices from the whole world. Imagine how transformative that is. Imagine what it's like to turn on the electricity switch in rural Turkey and have light for the first time ever. So these are the sort of enormous technological changes that were happening in the past. We've got motor cars for the first time. Commercially sold motor cars, which completely changes the geography of countries. Again, this all happens 100 years ago. You have elevators. Imagine a world without elevators, a world without skyscrapers, a world without height. So all these things come together 100 years ago, and fascinatingly, people adapted.
Duyabiliyor musunuz?
Also, you think in 1922, Einstein wins the Nobel Prize. Einstein. So we're moving into the nuclear age, right? Freud is setting up clinics all around Europe to explain people's dreams to them. So psychoanalysis is taking over. These are huge, huge changes. Picasso is going through his blue period, right? So in art, in technology, in exactly what we're talking about, there are enormous changes
Duyabiliyor musunuz?
100 years ago. And of course, for an Irish person, and for somebody who likes literature, in 1922, the book that changed the English language, the book that has been voted the best book of the 20th century, the novel that changed the world, the novel that basically allowed modernism to come through, was a novel called Ulysses. And it was written by James Joyce. And Joyce publishes Ulysses on the second day of the second month of the second year of the second decade. And with that, he announces modernity. So Ulysses is this extraordinary book that Joyce wrote when he was in Trieste in Paris. And what he did was he changed the way in which the English language and the form of the novel forever. There has been nothing written like this, because he liberated people. Picasso did the same in art. Freud did the same in psychoanalysis. Einstein did the same in science. All of these things happened at the fusion of technology and art. And I want to tell you a little story about Joyce. It's not always you have economists sitting up here talking to you about literature. But what we're talking about today, and the entire theme of this conference, is the fusion of technology and art. And the fusion of technology and art is what creates innovation. And innovation is what drives the economy forward. So if you have a healthy artistic sector with artists doing their thing, and a technological sector or an entrepreneurial sector with people combining technology to create new companies, you have something phenomenal. And I'll tell you a little story about Joyce. In 1909, so imagine 1909, a very tall, lanky, 27-year-old man is on a very old ship going between England and Ireland. If you've been up in our neck of the woods, you'll know the seas are very, very rough. Okay, they can become enormously rough in the winter, simply because Ireland is here, little island, and England is there, and all the water of the Atlantic is funneled through this tiny channel between our two countries. And Joyce is coming home, and he's standing on the ship, and he's vomiting excessively because he's seasick. And the question is, why is Joyce coming home to Ireland in 1909? And what has this got to do with art and technology? Joyce is coming home because he's going to do something that will change his life. And in order to put a little bit of flesh on this, you have to see that in 3 or 4 months before that, so it's October 1909, around August or September 1909, James Joyce's sister visits him in Trieste. Trieste, as you know, is the city in the north of Italy. At the time, Trieste was the only port of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. It was a cosmopolitan, liberal, tolerant, thriving city. And Joyce's sister is trying to find James Joyce, the great writer. And the great writer can't be found for days, and the reason is he's in the cinema. So the biggest technological advance in entertainment at that time was the cinema. Europeans, and certainly Turks, were obsessed by it. And in Trieste at the time, there were 27 cinemas. And Joyce spent the entire day and night, because they opened 24 hours, which is amazing when you think about it. But 100 years ago, things were open all the time. And Joyce's sister says to him, when he comes home one night after his long spates in the cinema, she says, "Do you know, James, that there are no cinemas in Dublin, my hometown?" Dublin at the time was much bigger than Trieste. We had no cinemas because we had this very, very conservative regimes at the time. And Joyce says to himself, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to find people who finance cinemas in Trieste. I'm going to take their money, and I'm going to go back to Ireland, and I'm going to open a cinema, the very, very first one in the country. So what he does in Trieste, he goes and he finds 4 investors. Now you'd call them in technology, I don't know, seed investors or a private equity fund or something like this. He finds those guys, he gets their money, he negotiates a contract, he comes home to Dublin, and within 7 weeks, he opens the very first cinema in Ireland. And at the time, this was like opening a startup, because cinema was the technology of the future. Because what it did to people, it transformed theatre. So people were always used to this sort of thing, people getting up and standing and talking, but the idea of cinema, the idea of projecting to the future, this was an unbelievably exciting technology. Joyce does this, sets up the cinema. Cinema is incredibly successful. He leaves Ireland to go back to Trieste. Now, the reason this story is interesting for what we're talking about is what you see there is the greatest novelist in the English language, the greatest one, without a shadow of a doubt, is also a technological entrepreneur. He's using technology. He's using the technology of the day to try and start a new business. Now the question is, why would that surprise you? Because if you think about the type of mind that writes an extraordinary novel, the type of mind that does something beautifully creative, the type of mind that is curious enough and brave enough and courageous enough to back themselves, the writer, and the type of mind that sets up a technological company or any entrepreneurial venture, what we see is they are precisely the same type of people. The artist and the entrepreneur, which is exactly what we're talking about today, okay? The artist lives in the world of risk. The artist lives in the world of jeopardy. The artist lives and dies by his or her work, and what we know is that the market is immediate in terms of whether the work is good or bad. This is exactly the same as the entrepreneur. The entrepreneur lives in the world of risk. The entrepreneur needs enormous courage to do what they are doing. The entrepreneur doesn't know, like the artist, when they start writing or painting, whether or not it's going to work. Because nobody can tell you in advance whether your work is any good. It's only when it goes out to the market. So what we see are people with extraordinarily similar mindsets. And one of the things that we should look at is setting up your own company. Like I'm looking at here all these young kids, okay? Setting up your own company is an act of defiance. It is a defiant act. What you're actually saying to the world is, I can do better. I've seen that product, I'm going to make it better. Writing a book is exactly the same. It is a defiant, artistic act of self-expression. What you're saying is, I have a voice, and that voice I want you to hear, and that voice is going to change your mind. So the artist has this fire within them, this kind of fire in their belly, okay, to say something, to give expression. And the entrepreneur is exactly the same type of person, which is why, if you contrast, if you go back to school, imagine you're back in school, and you think of the people you sat beside in school, which may be traumatic for you, I don't really know, right? But the artistic people and the entrepreneurial people, the people who ended up running their own companies, and the people who ended up doing art, are exactly the same type of mindset. And at the very, very core of this is courage. The very core of this is courage, because commercial self-expression is risky, and artistic self-expression is risky. But the society that combines these two types of individuals and actually dignifies their efforts is a society that will become incredibly wealthy very, very quickly. And the reason is that these are innovative people, and innovation is what makes the economy tick. Nothing else matters in economics except the spark inside people. If you think about it, when you're doing economics, people say, oh, well, it must be all about the currency or inflation. Or no. The most important economic engine in the world is this little mad thing between everyone's ears called the human mind. The human brain, that's where it all comes from. And if you liberate the human brain, if you allow the human brain to express itself, what you will find is the very people I'm talking about, the James Joyces of this world, okay? Those people will find their place in society. If you suppress those people, you will not have creativity, and society will go backwards. And again, what we're talking about here is the fusion of technology, commercial innovation, and artistic innovation. They all come together in this fusion. And once you understand that basically what it is, it's a mindset. And we need to encourage, and this is why what Gonja is doing here is so fantastic, because what she's doing is she's encouraging inquiry, she's encouraging curiosity, she's encouraging people to back themselves. And that is what it's all about. And the type of brain, the type of person, the type of personality that makes great art, and the type of personality that makes great commerce and great companies using technology are exactly the same type of person. And those people need to be embraced, celebrated, encouraged, understood, because they're not always easy. When you hang around with artists or writers, they can be quite awkward. But the awkwardness is exactly what you need to be, because awkwardness really is a default position of people who think they have something to say, and they don't go along with the crowd. And the reason this is all crucially important right now is because of what Lenin said, that there are decades when nothing happens, and there are weeks when decades happen, because the world around us, and it's not whether you're in Turkey or in Ireland or anywhere in Europe, or God forbid in Ukraine or in Russia, the world around us is not going to give us the sort of support to bail us out. So it has to come from inside. It has to come from inside, because we're going into a period, a decade, which I believe will be very, very like the 1920s. There will be huge convulsions. You imagine what happened in Turkey in the 1920s. Think about it. Think about changing your alphabet. Think about how incredibly disruptive that must have been. Think about having a new country. Think about people moving. Think about ethnic problems, all those things. These are all new things. So this is what we're going into. But at the very, very core is the spark of innovation that comes from the artistic mind, the technological mind, and the commercial mind, which is what Ganja's trying to do here, to fuse all these together. And I'll just leave you with a poem that was also published in 1922. Also an Irish poem. Sorry, you're getting a bit too much Irish stuff of Joyce. And I'm going to give you a guy called W.B. Yeats. William Butler Yeats was a Nobel Prize-winning Irish poet. He is our national poet. And he published a lovely little book of poetry, again in this seminal year, 100 years ago, called The Dancer, which in itself is a beautiful expression. I always feel that innovation actually makes the economy dance. That's what we have to get to. We've got to get to a stage where the economy is dancing. And people make the economy dance. And bright people, and innovative people, creative people make the economy dance. So the little book of poetry was called The Dancer, but I can remember it because we had to learn it in school. And if anybody, well, you wouldn't have been educated by Jesuits in this room, but, you know, it's a strange experience, the Jesuitical order, when it comes to learning stuff. But you remember the poetry that priests told you to remember when you were about 14. But I'm just going to leave you with these words. This poem was written in 1921. It was published in 1922, and the poet is sitting in Dublin, and he's trying to make sense of the world. He's trying to make sense of the emergence of Turkey, the end of the Ottoman Empire. He's trying to make sense of the fact that the Austrian-Hungarian Empire has collapsed. He's trying to make sense of the fact that Ireland, our country, has been split and carved down, and big borders put, not in the middle, but just in the north, and this bit is hived off, and that remains British, and we're now a new state, but we've no money. What are we going to do? It's all very well having a new state, but then you've got to figure out what you're going to do with it. He's trying to figure out all this technological change, and he writes this poem called The Second Coming. And I'll just leave you with these words, and think about what's happening in the world now, and think about the words of the poet. It goes, turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed on the streets, a blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the procession of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, the worst are full of passionate intensity. Now just think of those words. I know it's English, I know it's very early in the morning, I know it's a foreign language. I hope the translator got all that stuff, because it's a kind of elegant way of writing the language. But what Yeats was writing about, he said, turning and turning in a widening gyre. A gyre is a big storm that happens in the Atlantic, just off the north coast of Ireland, which is basically you don't want to be caught in that if you're out in a ship. Okay, huge Atlantic storms that come in that I suspect make the Bosphorus look very, very calm. The falcon cannot hear the falconer. The falcon is the dangerous thing. It has broken free of the falconer, which is the man who controls that bird. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. What he's saying is that sometimes, like now, things do fall apart. All our assumptions about the world can be wrong. The center, the very core of our being, the core of our state, the core of what we assume to be stable, disintegrates. Violence, he talks about anarchy on the streets, he talks about a blood-dimmed tide because it was an incredibly violent year, 1922. Here in Turkey, extraordinary violence. In Ireland, extraordinary violence. All around Europe, extraordinary violence. Exactly as is happening in Ukraine right now. But then he says one thing, and I'll leave you with these words. There's violence, there's anarchy, the procession of innocence. Innocence is drowned, we become, that age of naivety is over, we've got to mature. But then he says something about how change happens, and this is the key. He said the change and the difficulties happen if the best lack all conviction, allowing the worst to be full of passionate intensity. And what he's saying is that all these conundrums, all these dilemmas, all these problems will be made much worse if the best people in society lack all conviction. Say, well, you know, it's not my problem. I'll just, you know, worry about something else. I'll go and watch Galatasaray or whatever, right? Okay? I'm sure I've offended half the audience by saying Galatasaray and not Fenerbahce, but anyway. Or the other crowd, Beşiktaş, where I was assaulted by a barber.